against 11 suspects and 9 so-called concerned persons. It was never quite clear what their role was. This involved complete surveillance of phone GPS devices in cars, a copy machine that was used by one anti-nuclear activist group was completely monitored. And all national meetings of the anti-nuclear movement in Germany were completely observed by the police. The case was dropped years later without any result, but a lot of data was gathered about many of the political activists in Germany. Interesting here is that now the German police submitted names and information about this case to the French police who are investigating the case in Tarnac in France. There's other cases that I'll just quickly mention. The terrorism investigation concerning the G8 summit in Germany, which was started. The G8 summit, you will remember this, was taking place in 2007 in Germany, in Heiligendamm. And there was a so-called terrorist organization aiming to destroy, to attack the economic G8 summit. 1 month before the summit, there were raids in 40 places. It was an investigation against 18 people who were submitted to complete surveillance. When the raids took place, there was a police officer quoted on German TV saying, well, he didn't say that they didn't have clear evidence, but what he did say was that we just shot in the bush to see what starts to move when we try to stir up things a little bit. There was no evidence at all, just the assumption that there is this organization. This case was dropped in 2008, actually some days before the start of the trial against the 3 people who are now currently assumed to be the militant group. Another case, which is called the Bad Oldesloe case, was started in 2006 as well against first 4 and later 11 people. Raids in 15 apartments, and it's a case against young anti-fascists who all live in a little place in the north of Germany called Bad Oldesloe, who were not interested in the G8 summit, which was rather rare among political activists in Germany 1 year before the summit, because most everybody somehow tried to relate to this summit protest activities, which were clear to become quite big. But these anti-fascists were not interested in the G8 summit. They were interested in fascists and anti-fascist activities in their village, and this was seen to be highly conspiratorial and very suspicious by the police. If they never talked about the G8 summit on the phone, then they must have extremely conspiratorial methods of communicating to hide their interest in the G8 summit. The initial suspicion was against a couple that had both their mobile phones active in the same radio cell. An attack took place. They were actually accused of also attacking military vehicles and setting them on fire, I think. Another really hilarious story in this context is that one of the suspects used to have dreadlocks, like these long funny hair. And at some point during the investigation, he cut them off. And you can find in the files a note about this incident when the German police tries to interpret why he has his hair cut off. And the only possible interpretation, they can think he must have been involved in some kind of arson attack, and then he probably burned his hair to hide that he cut them off. There is no evidence, no proof for this. It's just a theory, but this is being put in the files and then used against them. What you see here up there is a GPS device that was found in one of the cars, or under one of the cars of the defendants, that became quite popular because it was found by the suspects and then through the lawyer that tried to give it back to the police, but the police said, it's not ours. And the Secret Service says, not ours. And so they said, well, we have this thing and nobody claims it's theirs. What do? Well, we keep it. And after a while, they were actually starting an investigation against the person who had found that thing for illegal possession of this GPS device. Which was then dropped by the judge in court, who said, well, if nobody claims it's theirs, it can't be illegally obtained or possessed. And the quotations in that thing, I advise you to research that. It's nice to read, except probably for the people concerned who still have it and nobody wants to have it back. And the last thing I want to mention is the several cases against people who are accused of being the militant group in Germany. The first case became known in 2001 against first 3 people, later 5 people, with raids in 6 places over the years. They had complete surveillance, GPS, bugs in their apartments, video cameras outside their homes, phone and email monitored, listening devices during conversations. Andre also had this when they try to follow a conversation between a suspect and another suspect. Civil clothes police take microphones and listening devices and try to follow them, for example, into a bar and try to listen to the conversation. And this also happened in this first case against the militant group. I think there's 3 different sets of files against different kinds of people who were accused to be militant group. Andre and 3 others being the 4th set of people who were said to be militant group. The first 3 cases, interestingly enough, were now finally closed just before the trial against the last group of 3 people who are currently said to be militant group after Andre was accused to be militant group. And so the first 3 sets were closed just some days before the trial was opened. And this trial is actually still going on now in the Berlin court in Moabit, and that in itself would fill a complete talk about very strange details, how this trial is being led. I'm not going into that because I only have 5 minutes left and maybe you want to ask some questions. Interesting detail still is that in all of the files to the different cases of the militant group, there's 2,000 people's names in the files who were at some point or the other checked by the police for criminal record or political activities. The last set we found when just some weeks ago we were handed over 82 new folders of files concerning Andre Holm. And it is widely believed that after the federal court in Germany decided that militant group is not a terrorist group, that the case against Andre was dropped. Far from it. The investigation is still going on. He is still being under surveillance, probably. We are not being told about the details of this, but recently got all of these new files that show quite clearly that we are being monitored quite closely, including public events that we do. Also outside the country, and it is visible in the files that both Secret Service, which is Verfassungsschutz, and the federal police are reading my blog to understand better about where we are and what we do. For example, what really quite irritated me, even though it's not surprising to hear that an address book with many phone numbers was found on my desk during the raid of our apartment, and all people in there, old school friends, colleagues, whoever was closely checked by the police, noted whether they have some kind of police record and whatever else activities they may have engaged in. One really interesting little last detail that I would like to add is that we found in the files that the German police found several encrypted files on Andre's computer. And we are happy to announce that the federal police in Germany apparently is not able to decrypt GNU-PG files. There's an interesting communication when the federal police is looking at the files and wondering what they are and looking at the kind of files they are. They, after a while, detect this must be PGP. And then they try to find out how to decrypt this kind of thing. And they are told that there is this professor at the Department of Information Systems and Information Management at the University of Cologne, Professor Dr. Detlef Schoder, and they ask him for help to decrypt the files, and Professor Schoder offers to send his assistant, Martin Wundram, to have a look at several encrypted files found on Andre's computer. Professor Schoder, just for looking at the files, not for attempting to decrypt them, just for looking at this, wanted to charge the federal police €5,000. The federal police in Germany said, So what are you going to do? Is this going to be successful? And then the professor said that, well, he has some powerful machines trying to decrypt, and actually it must be admitted that they also found Andre's private key on this computer. But with this private key, what he was going to do is basically guess passphrases. And said that if the passphrases are any longer than 8 characters, and if they contain any special characters, it's practically impossible to decrypt. So now you know how to save your files. Passphrases longer than 8 signs and special characters, and you can be considered pretty safe. The federal police dropped the offer, didn't want to waste the €5,000, and we don't know what they are doing with these encrypted files so far. Just some quick conclusions to what I've told you this far. I think there is a public perception of what terrorism is. This public perception is fed daily by politicians and by the media. It creates fear of bomb attacks, of biological or chemical attacks against the wide public in Europe or North America and most everywhere in the world. The public perception of terrorism is I think, one that involves many deaths, similar to the legal definition, which says terrorism intimidates the populations, it threatens governments or states. It's something like 9/11 or the bomb attacks on Madrid or London. But this hardly ever takes place, at least in Europe or North America. When we look at Central Asia, this is an entirely different thing, but that's not what people are afraid of here. On the other hand, there is a lot of anti-terrorist prosecution taking place. This includes many trials and also prison terms for people and surveillance against a huge number of people. These cases hardly ever involve violence against people, with some exceptions that have a long tradition and history. For example, the ETA in the Basque Country, or the Corsican groups that are trying to separate from France. But I think all the other cases would not be considered to be terrorist by most people. What is not comprised by this definition of terrorism is right-wing violence, which happens so much and kills so many people, but this also is not being labeled as terrorist, even though I would consider that by far more terrorist than attacks against trains or even maybe setting fire to laboratories, which is debatable, no doubt, but also doesn't endanger people and doesn't kill anyone. What is similar in these investigations, more so I can talk about Germany here because I don't know the details about the other countries, is that I have the impression that the investigations often look to prove their case, and they interpret all possible evidence against the suspects. If you show some behavior that contradicts the suspicion, e.g. you don't talk about special subject, you're not interested in certain things, you don't have anything to do with certain people who are facing the same charges, the only possible interpretation for the police can be that you are extremely conspiratorial about it, that you must have certain ways that make it necessary to even enforce more observation and more surveillance to find out your terrorist activity. When there is no visible evidence, it means the suspects must be working harder to hide suspicious or criminal behavior. I think in public perception, terrorism now is perceived as fundamentalist Islamic terrorism. The terrorism investigations that are going on here now concern groups and individuals who express political dissent, who are involved in political actions and sometimes property damages, and sometimes even with a lot of financial damage, but without people being hurt or being killed. There's no comparison, for example, to the attack in Oklahoma City in 1995 when 168 people were killed. Europol counts 583 cases of terrorist attacks in the European Union in 2007. This is from the Europol report on terrorist attacks in Europe in 2007. More of 500 of these are so-called separatist attacks, mostly, like I said, by ETA and the Corsican movements, but also 15 in Germany. When I saw that, I wondered, 15 separatist terrorist attacks in 2007 in Germany? How did I miss that? Interesting theory. Looking at the report, I found out that these 15 attacks are set